My son sat at the far end of the long oak table, his back straight, his cufflinks catching the muted winter light that slanted through the tall sash windows. The solicitor's office smelled faintly of leather and polish, the air thick with that peculiar hush you only hear in rooms where fortunes are about to change hands. Oliver leaned toward me, close enough that I caught the faint spice of his cologne, the kind he wore to board meetings, not family dinners. His voice was pitched low, smooth, confident, the voice of a man who believed the next few minutes would prove him right. "You gave up your rights the day you walked out, Mum," he whispered, his lips barely moving. "Don't expect a penny from Dad's will." I didn't answer. My gaze stayed fixed on the man across from us. Mr. Bernard Carroll, silver-haired, sharp-eyed behind neat wire-rimmed spectacles. He sat behind the table with the kind of quiet authority you can't fake, his files stacked in precise order before him. Mr. Carroll's mouth twitched into the smallest of smiles, almost as if he'd overheard. He cleared his throat softly. "You might want to stay for this, Mrs. Whitmore," he said, voice calm, deliberate. I didn't blink. My hands stayed folded neatly in my lap, the same place they'd been since I'd walked into the room 10 minutes earlier. "My name is Eleanor Grace Whitmore. I'm 68 years old, and I'm here to tell you how a funeral, a will, and a man I hadn't spoken to in 26 years turned my life on its head." The walls around us were lined with books, rows of leather-bound law volumes and neatly arranged binders, the sort of decor designed to suggest permanence and power. Behind Mr. Carroll's chair, a tall window let in the weak gold light of a late January afternoon, the kind that reminds you the day is slipping away. I'd driven down to Lincoln's Inn from my little flat in Surrey that morning, not entirely sure why. When the letter from Whitmore Holdings estate office had arrived, I nearly tossed it into the recycling bin. I assumed it was a mistake, an administrative courtesy. I hadn't been part of Daniel's life for more than 2 decades. I didn't go to his second wedding. I didn't call when he retired from the front line of the company. I certainly didn't ask for anything when he opened his gleaming office towers in Mayfair, Manchester, and Edinburgh. I left that world behind in 1999, the day I packed my old Vauxhall with 2 suitcases and the last 15 from our joint account. Everything Daniel built afterwards, well, that was his doing. Or so people liked to say. But I remembered a different man, the one who couldn't balance a checkbook but could make a battered upright piano sound like it held the truth of the world in its keys. I was there at the beginning. I just wasn't there at the end. Until now. Oliver sat to my left, his legs crossed, his eyes flicking toward the door as though he had somewhere more important to be. The gray of his bespoke suit was so precise, it might have been matched to the color of his ambition. He looked like he belonged on the cover of a finance magazine. Clean lines, perfect hair, every inch of him measured not just in inches, but in ego. I barely recognized him in moments like this. His tone, his posture, even the way he addressed me as Mum, these days felt like a performance, something polished for public display, not for me. The receptionist had shown us in just before noon, leading us past the hushed corridors and heavy doors of the old law chambers. We'd ridden up the narrow lift in silence, and Oliver hadn't spoken a single word to me until we sat down. "You really came," he'd murmured under his breath, not looking at me. "That's brave." I'd simply removed my coat, folded it carefully over my lap, and said nothing. Now, Mr. Carroll adjusted the papers before him and looked at us both over the rim of his spectacles. "As you both know," he began, "Mr. Daniel Charles Whitmore passed on the 6th of March, 2025. This will was written on the 22nd of January this year, witnessed and notarized according to the laws of England and Wales." Oliver shifted in his chair, already wearing a small smile. The solicitor's voice carried on, but for a moment I wasn't listening. My eyes had wandered to a framed photograph on the shelf behind him, a black and white shot of the Royal Courts of Justice. Perhaps it had been taken on his first day as a barrister. I'd seen enough of those offices in the years after my divorce, sitting across from solicitors trying to work out what counted as mine and what didn't. Back then, there hadn't been much to divide. When I left Daniel, we had one rental property, an aging Jaguar, and the small cafe we co-owned, which I signed over to him simply to keep the peace. I took the car, a few boxes of books, and my maiden name back. Everything else, the hotels, the development firms, the private equity deals, the glossy headquarters on Bishopsgate, he built without me. That, at least, was the story he told the world. Mr. Carroll's voice broke through again. As stated in the will, both Eleanor Whitmore and Oliver Whitmore are named beneficiaries. Oliver's eyebrow lifted, the smirk on his face tightening into something more deliberate. He glanced at me with a look that said, "Don't get your hopes up. Don't let that word fool you," he muttered under his breath. "He's probably left you a watch or one of his old records." I kept my gaze forward, my hands still. The solicitor shuffled the top page, his expression unreadable. "We will begin with the real estate, then move on to the investment portfolio, and finally, the personal designations." And then he smiled, not cruelly, not mockingly, just a small, knowing lift of the lips. "You might want to stay for this." I didn't flinch. I'd sat through worse. But even then, I didn't know just how far the ground beneath us was about to shift, or how many things I thought I knew were about to be undone, one sentence at a time. Outside, the streets of London carried on as though nothing extraordinary was happening. Cars weaving through the drizzle, the faint echo of footsteps on wet pavements. Inside, the air in that room seemed to contract. Oliver sat like a man awaiting his coronation, and I sat like a woman expecting nothing. But somewhere, deep in the marrow of me, a question began to stir. The same question that had flickered in the back of my mind from the moment the letter arrived. Why had Daniel named me at all? That question would carry me back in time before the solicitor ever reached the final page. But for now, I kept my eyes on Mr. Carroll's steady hands as he reached for the thick folder at his side. He opened it slowly, the rustle of the paper impossibly loud in the stillness. I knew, without quite knowing how, that nothing about this day would end the way Oliver expected. And though I didn't yet realize it, nothing about this day would leave me unchanged. When you leave someone, you think you're leaving the arguments, the cold silences, the slammed doors. What you don't realize at the time is that you're also leaving an entire version of yourself behind. For years after I walked out on Daniel Whitmore, I avoided even the edges of his world. I didn't go to his second wedding. I didn't call when he retired from the front line of the company. I didn't send a card when his property empire expanded to Manchester, then Edinburgh. The man I married had been gone long before I left. Whatever remained was his to keep. We met in the summer of 1973 in Brighton. I was 21, working in a small bookshop just off the seafront, selling paperbacks to tourists and brewing tea for the regulars. Daniel walked in one Tuesday afternoon, wearing a linen shirt a size too big for him and carrying a rolled-up sheaf of sheet music. He asked me if I knew where he could find a decent jazz club in the area. I did, but I wasn't about to hand out free directions to every stranger who came in. He bought a battered Penguin Classic from the front table, left with a grin, and came back the next day with a paper cup of sweet tea and the same question. That time, I told him. That evening, I found myself at the back of a dimly lit club just off Ship Street, watching him sit at a piano that had seen better days. He wasn't famous, not even close, but when his fingers touched the keys, the room shifted. He didn't play for applause. He played like it was the only way he knew how to speak. After that, we were rarely apart. We'd take long walks along the pier, eat greasy fish and chips out of paper, stay up late in all-night cafes talking about the lives we were going to have. Daniel wanted to open a music cafe, somewhere local players could find a stage, where the coffee was strong and the air was thick with melody. I believed in that dream. I still do. We married in April 1974. My wedding dress cost $45 from a charity shop, and Daniel's suit didn't quite fit in the shoulders, but we laughed our way through the whole ceremony. We were in love. Back then, that seemed enough. In 1976, we opened the Whitmore Note. 2 rooms, second-hand furniture, a piano in the corner, black and white photographs of jazz legends on the walls. I baked scones and sweet rolls in our tiny flat's kitchen. Daniel played every Friday night while people clapped along and sipped cheap wine. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours. Those were the best years of my life. Oliver was born in 1978. I remember Daniel crying the first time he held him, promising to teach him piano before he could even walk. Our boy, he said, would have music in his bones. But somewhere in the early 80s, something shifted. Daniel started taking outside gigs, weddings, corporate dinners, less for the joy of it and more because they paid well. A friend roped him into a vending machine venture that snowballed into buying a used car lot. From there, it was rental properties, storage facilities, even a small chain of car washes. The piano gathered dust. He still played, but not for the joy of it, more out of habit, and usually when no one was around. I asked him once if he missed it. He just said, "Music doesn't pay the bills, Ellie." That stung. We used to tell each other it wasn't about the bills. The cafe began to lose money, not because people didn't love it, but because Daniel's time and attention were elsewhere. One day he came home and told me he'd sold it. He hadn't asked me, hadn't even mentioned it beforehand. I remember standing in our small kitchen, dishcloth in hand, staring at him like I didn't recognize the man I'd married. The sharp edges kept coming. In 1984, I miscarried while Daniel was in Manchester at a property conference. I phoned him from the hospital. He said he'd try to catch the next train back. He didn't make it. When he finally arrived, the first thing he said wasn't, "Are you all right? But you should have called sooner." I didn't answer. What could I say? After that, our conversations shrank to bills, groceries, and Oliver's school timetable. I began keeping a journal just to feel like someone, anyone, was listening. The affairs crept in quietly. Perfume on shirts that wasn't mine. Restaurant receipts for dinners I hadn't cooked. Necklaces I hadn't worn. One night, I waited up for him until 2 in the morning. When he came in, I asked if there was someone else. He looked tired, not guilty, not even defensive, just tired. "I don't know," he said. "Does it matter?" I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just nodded, went into Oliver's room, and slept there. The next morning, I began packing. In 1999, I put what I could into the Vauxhall: clothes, Oliver's school things, his birth certificate, and left. Oliver was 11. I told him we were going to live somewhere quieter, that his father would visit. Daniel didn't contest custody. He didn't ask questions. Sometimes I think he was relieved, like clearing space for the next phase of his life. For a long time after, I thought of him less as the man who broke my heart, and more as the man who stopped playing the piano. Oliver was mine for a while, not just by law, but in spirit. Those early years after the divorce, we lived in small rented flats, sometimes in the upstairs of someone else's house. I took whatever work I could, managing a cafe, cleaning offices in the evenings. We didn't have much, but we had enough. I showed up for every parent's evening, every school play, every scraped knee. On Saturdays, we'd sit on the floor of the local library and read until closing time. He liked things orderly. No crusts on his sandwiches. Bedtime stories with the ending changed to make him laugh. Daniel sent money regularly, always on time, never late, but never with a note. Just his signature at the bottom of a bank transfer form. When Oliver was 13, Daniel invited him to spend Christmas in London. I didn't love the idea, but I told myself it was important for him to know both sides of his family. He came back with a suitcase full of new clothes and stories about ski trips and business dinners. It was the beginning of a slow drift I couldn't stop. The next summer, Daniel paid for a youth leadership program in Scotland. After that, it was tennis lessons, coding camps, private tutoring for his GCSEs. By 16, Oliver was spending more time in Daniel's world than mine. I tried to hold on, cooked his favorite meals, sat with him in the evenings even when he rolled his eyes. But he'd already started to measure life by a different set of rules. By 18, he was completely absorbed into Daniel's orbit. He wore cufflinks to his school leavers ball. He quoted investment podcasts at breakfast. He told me I should consider refinancing my car through a more efficient lender. Once he said, "Mum, you've got to stop living like it's 1975. The world's changed." I just nodded. What else was there to say? Oliver went on to Durham University, tuition courtesy of Daniel. He got a new SUV and a city center apartment lease co-signed by his father. I sent him a care package his first term, socks, granola bars, a handwritten note. He never mentioned it. From then on, our contact was what I call calendar contact. Birthdays, Christmas, the occasional text. Polite, but nothing more. The last real conversation we had, I asked if he ever missed the little house with the garden gnome outside. He laughed. "That place was so cute, Mum. But honestly, I was always a bit embarrassed to bring friends over." That one cut deep. So when the letter from the estate office arrived, inviting me to the reading of Daniel's will, I assumed it was a formality. Some legal technicality. Why would Daniel leave me anything? I had no idea that the man who'd once turned his back on me had also kept a door open all those years. Locked, yes, but not gone. And I couldn't have imagined just how wide that door was about to swing. In the years right after I left Daniel, it was just Oliver and me against the world. Our life wasn't glamorous, but it had its own kind of rhythm, a pattern I could rely on. School runs in the morning, my shifts at the cafe, homework at the kitchen table, evenings reading side by side. I could tell you exactly where Oliver's socks were at any given moment. The name of his favorite dinosaur, the way he liked his toast, barely browned, with just enough butter to soak in. We didn't have central heating half the time, so in winter, I'd warm his pajamas on the radiator in the sitting room before bed. On Saturday mornings, we'd walk to the library and sit cross-legged in the children's section until the librarian flicked the lights to signal closing time. He never complained about the hand-me-down clothes or the tinned soup nights. If anything, he seemed happiest in those small, predictable routines. Back then, I believed love and stability were enough. I didn't see the drift beginning until it was already well underway. When Oliver was 13, Daniel invited him to spend Christmas in London. "He's still your father," I told myself as I folded Oliver's jumpers into a suitcase. It's good for him to know both sides. Daniel's both sides was a very different world. While Oliver's bedroom in our rented flat was small enough to touch both walls if you stretched your arms, Daniel put him in a guest suite with an ensuite bath and a view over Hyde Park. They went to West End shows, ate dinner in places with more forks on the table than I owned at home, took day trips to ski slopes in the Alps. When Oliver came back in January, he was full of stories. Glossy, polished stories, each one brighter than the next. There was a weight to the way he talked about those 2 weeks, as if a door had opened to a better life, one he didn't want to close again. The changes were subtle at first. He didn't stop hugging me, but the hugs grew shorter, the silences after school a little longer. He stopped asking me to sit with him while he did his homework. The library trips happened less often. When I mentioned walking into town for a hot chocolate, he'd say he had other plans. Then the comments started, quiet observations that stung more than outright criticism. "Dad's flat has a dishwasher," he said once while drying plates beside me. Another time, It's weird not having a lift in the building. I laughed them off, but each remark left a tiny bruise. By 14, Daniel had paid for Oliver to attend a youth leadership program in Scotland. That summer, he came back taller, sharper, more careful with his words, as if he'd learned the value of always sounding in control. The following year, it was tennis lessons, coding camps, private tutors for his GCSEs. Daniel's money wrapped itself around Oliver's life like ivy, creeping into every gap I couldn't fill. I couldn't compete with ski trips and bespoke suits, nor did I try to. But it was hard not to notice how his eyes lit up more when talking about Daniel's world than about anything we shared. I still tried to hold on. I cooked his favorite meals: shepherd's pie, spaghetti bolognese, the lemon drizzle cake he used to beg for. Sometimes he'd eat them without comment, scrolling through his phone between bites. I sat with him in the evenings, even when he rolled his eyes, asked about his day, even when the answer was a flat fine. By 16, Oliver was spending every other weekend, then whole school holidays, at Daniel's. My little flat in Surrey began to feel like a stopover rather than a home. He still called me Mum, but the word started to sound more like a formality than a name. The transformation accelerated in sixth form. Oliver began wearing shirts to school even when he didn't have to. He quoted business podcasts over breakfast, telling me about market volatility as if I'd asked. He told me to consider getting a better rate on my car loan. Once, he looked at our living room, the mismatched sofa cushions, the scuffed coffee table, and said, almost absently, "You've got to stop living like it's 1975, Mum. The world's changed." I just nodded. I didn't have the energy to explain that my world had changed long before he was born, and not in the way he meant. When he turned 18, Daniel made sure the launch into adulthood was seamless. Oliver had a place at Durham University, tuition covered, a brand new SUV, and a high-rise city apartment co-signed by his father. I sent him a care package in his first term: thick socks, granola bars, a handwritten letter telling him I loved him and missed him. He never mentioned receiving it. From then on, our connection narrowed to what I called calendar contact. Birthdays, Christmas, maybe a text if something important happened. Our conversations were polite, efficient, and strangely hollow, like speaking to someone at a networking event, not your own child. The last time we had what might be called a real conversation, I asked him if he ever missed the little house we'd lived in when he was small. The one with the crooked fence and the plaster garden gnome by the front step. That place was cute, he said, with a quick smile. But honestly, I was always a bit embarrassed to bring friends over. It was such a small sentence, but it cut deep. I didn't let it show. "I always liked that gnome," I said. He laughed. "You're still sentimental." He didn't mean it unkindly, but the gap between us felt like a canyon. I could see the other side, but I didn't know how to cross anymore. I used to believe he might come back one day. Not literally move in with me, but return in spirit. The boy who'd curled up beside me on the sofa to watch old detective shows. The boy who'd begged for just one more chapter before bed. I imagined him growing tired of the endless networking, the curated life, and showing up at my door just to sit and talk, maybe ask for a recipe. That day never came. Instead, I watched from a distance as he became exactly the man Daniel had groomed him to be. Immaculate suits, first-class flights, photographs with politicians and CEOs. His LinkedIn was a parade of awards, keynote speeches, and carefully worded insights about vision and leadership. In every picture, he looked like a man who had never known a hard day in his life. So when Oliver looked at me in the solicitor's office and whispered that I shouldn't expect a penny, I didn't flinch. Not because it didn't hurt, it did, but because I understood something he didn't. I had never walked out on him. I had only walked away from a man who'd stopped playing the piano. The chapel stood on a rise at the edge of Mayfair. its white stone facade gleaming in the thin winter light. The drive curved past tall black gates and clipped box hedges, the kind of precision that speaks of money old enough to afford subtlety. I parked my small silver Ford at the far end of the gravel car park, well away from the gleaming black Jaguars and German saloons lined neatly in front. Mine was the only car with a cracked bumper and a faded charity shop sticker peeling from the rear window. I hadn't come to impress anyone. Inside, the place smelled faintly of lilies and polished wood. The pews were already 3/4 full, the quiet hum of conversation rising and falling in respectful waves. Men in dark, tailored suits, women in structured coats and understated pearls. Phones slipped into handbags, but never switched off entirely. Because for people like this, life is always partly on display. I moved down the side aisle, eyes catching on faces I half recognized from decades ago. Business associates, friends from the early years before the private jets and political dinners. Their expressions didn't soften when they saw me. If anything, they looked straight past me, back to their orders of service. I found an empty space near the back and sat, my navy coat buttoned to the collar. The pew was stiff, the air heavy and still, but I sat tall. I hadn't worn black. I didn't want to pretend grief I didn't feel. The crying had been done years earlier, in cramped kitchens, on the side of anonymous roads, in cheap motel rooms, while I tried to work out how to start over with an 11-year-old in tow. At the front, on a pedestal, was a large silver frame. Daniel looked younger in the photograph, perhaps 50, smiling just enough to appear approachable, not enough to seem soft. It was the same expression he'd worn for magazine profiles and shareholder meetings. Even in death, he was selling an image. The service began with a city councilor speaking of Daniel's vision and unshakable discipline. A business partner followed, detailing growth strategies and market positioning. Then a senior manager from his flagship development firm spoke of legacy and impact. Not one mentioned music, not one mentioned the cafe. When it was Oliver's turn, he walked to the podium with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to being listened to. His suit was flawlessly cut, his tie perfectly knotted. He stood tall, his voice carrying easily in the vaulted space. My father, he began, was the kind of man who saw opportunity where others saw walls. He wasn't just building a business, he was building a legacy. It was polished, practiced. 10 minutes of clean, professional tribute, sprinkled with enough personal detail to sound authentic, but not so much that it risked sentiment. He spoke of values, determination, and resilience. He thanked the guests for believing in his father's vision. He did not mention family. He did not mention me. I didn't expect him to. When the applause came, it was polite and precise, measured in the restrained way people in rooms like this show approval without revealing too much emotion. I kept my hands in my lap. After the service, the guests began to file out, murmuring to one another in low, smooth voices. I stayed in my seat, letting the crowd thin before making my way toward the side exit. That's when Oliver appeared, stepping into my path. His expression was calm, but his eyes were cold. "You shouldn't have come," he said quietly. I met his gaze. "I came to pay my respects." "He wouldn't have wanted you here." "Is that so?" "He said you walked away." I let the silence hang for a beat before answering. "And what did he say about why?" Oliver's jaw tightened. "Doesn't matter. You left." I thought of all the ways I could answer. How I could tell him that leaving was the only way I could still recognize myself in the mirror. How I'd left because staying would have hollowed me out completely. But I knew none of that would reach him. Instead, I said nothing. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so no one else could hear. "He didn't leave you anything, you know, so don't get any ideas. Just don't make a scene." I almost smiled, not because it was funny, but because it was exactly what I'd expected him to say. I'm not here for money, Oliver, I said. I was married to the man for 25 years. That counts for something, even if you don't think so. This is a business gathering, he said flatly. Don't turn it into a pity party. He turned away before I could reply, his shoulders squared, as if the conversation had never happened. Outside, the wind had picked up, slicing through my coat as I walked to the car. Clouds were thickening over the rooftops, the kind of low, heavy sky that promised rain before nightfall. I didn't drive straight home. Instead, I parked 2 streets away from the solicitor's office, where the will would be read later that afternoon. I sat in the car, watching people hurry past in their sharp coats and polished shoes, clutching takeaway coffees like props. At 4 o'clock, I went inside. The building was all polished floors and muted lighting. The receptionist's smile was professional, the kind that never quite touches the eyes. She led me down a quiet hallway to a room with a long table and high-backed leather chairs. Oliver was already there, seated at the far end with a tablet in front of him. He didn't look up. Mr. Carroll greeted me with a polite nod. "Mrs. Whitmore, glad you could join us." I took the seat opposite Oliver. A jug of water and 2 glasses sat in the center of the table, untouched. The air was taut, the kind of tension you can almost feel pressing against your skin. Mr. Carroll removed his glasses, cleaned them carefully with a folded cloth, then placed them back on his nose. "Well," he said, with the faintest hint of a smile, "shall we begin?" Oliver straightened in his chair, every inch the heir apparent. I sat still, my hands folded in my lap. Something in Mr. Carroll's expression told me that this was not going to go the way my son expected. And I was right. The solicitor's conference room was silent, but for the faint hum of the heating vents. The table between us felt like a no-man's land. Cold, polished oak, a jug of water no one touched, and 2 glasses that might as well have been decorative. Oliver sat with perfect posture, his tablet face down beside a leather notebook embossed with his initials. He looked like he was about to close a business deal, not hear the last words of his father. Mr. Carroll, the solicitor, glanced between us as if measuring how much trouble we might cause. He was in his late 60s, silver-haired, his black suit perfectly tailored, the kind of man who had been trusted with secrets longer than either of us had been alive. He opened a leather folder and began in the dry, steady tone of someone who has done this 1,000 times. "As executor of Mr. Daniel Whitmore's estate," he said, "it is my duty to read the final will and testament, dated the 14th of March last year." He paused, perhaps for effect, perhaps to give us time to ready ourselves. "Mr. Whitmore's estate," he continued, "is valued at approximately £34 million, excluding certain personal effects and properties held in trust." Oliver didn't flinch. His face remained a mask of polite control, but his shoulders shifted almost imperceptibly, relaxing, as if this was the confirmation he'd been expecting all along. Mr. Carroll cleared his throat. "To his son, Oliver Whitmore, Mr. Whitmore bequeaths—" Oliver leaned forward slightly. "A portfolio of investment properties currently valued at £12 million, along with all associated rental income. Additionally, the contents of the London penthouse at Grosvenor Square, excluding items specified later, and 1 vintage Aston Martin DB5 registration number." Oliver's lips curved into the smallest smile, the kind you try to suppress but can't quite hide. "And a cash sum of £2 million. I saw him breathe out, just a fraction longer than normal. That exhale said everything. Of course. This is how it should be. I sat still, hands folded in my lap. I'd come expecting nothing. Oliver had practically announced at the funeral that I'd be left out entirely. My role was to sit here, listen to the formalities, and leave quietly. But Mr. Carroll didn't close the folder. Instead, he looked down, then back up at me. "To his former wife, Eleanor Whitmore." Oliver's head snapped toward me, his expression momentarily unguarded. Surprise, then disbelief, then something sharper. Mr. Whitmore bequeaths the controlling share, 51%, of Whitmore Developments Limited, along with all voting rights attached to those shares. For a second, I thought I'd misheard him. Oliver made a sound, half laugh, half scoff. That can't be right. She doesn't even work in the company. Mr. Carroll's voice didn't waver. It is correct. I'll continue. In addition to the controlling shares, Mrs. Whitmore will receive the family estate at Harrowfield, including all furnishings and grounds, valued at approximately £8 million. I blinked. Harrowfield. I hadn't set foot there in over 20 years. I could still picture the long gravel drive, the walled gardens, the library with the window seat where I used to read while Daniel worked late. Oliver was staring at Mr. Carroll as though sheer disbelief could make him rewind and start over. And finally, Mr. Carroll said, Mrs. Whitmore is to receive a cash sum of £10 million, to be transferred from the primary estate account within 30 days of probate. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. This is absurd, Oliver said finally, leaning forward, his voice low but tight. She left him. They've been divorced for years. Why would he? Mr. Whitmore provided a letter of explanation to accompany his will. Mr. Carroll interrupted, lifting a sealed envelope from the folder. It is addressed to both of you. He placed it on the table, but neither of us reached for it. I could feel Oliver's gaze burning into me, but I kept my eyes on Mr. Carroll. Would you like me to read it aloud? The solicitor asked. Oliver made a dismissive gesture. Fine. Let's hear this. Explanation. Mr. Carroll unfolded the letter and began to read. To my son and to Eleanor, you may be surprised by the contents of this will, though I suspect one of you more than the other. I have built an empire in my lifetime, but I am not so arrogant as to think that money alone defines a legacy. Eleanor was there before the first building, before the first contract, before Whitmore Developments even had a name. She stood by me in years when we had nothing but a second-hand piano and an idea. For that, she owns a piece of everything I built, whether she is still my wife or not. To Oliver, you have been raised in comfort, and I have no doubt you will continue to thrive. But power should never go unchecked. The controlling shares go to Eleanor not to spite you, but to ensure the company remains anchored to its roots and values. One day they may pass to you, but not before you understand what it took to create them. Do not see this as a division, but as a balance. Mr. Carroll folded the letter neatly, returned it to the envelope, and set it aside. Oliver's jaw was rigid, his eyes dark. So you're telling me I'm supposed to answer to her now? She hasn't been part of this family for decades. Mr. Carroll's tone remained neutral. Legally, the controlling shares make Mrs. Whitmore the majority stakeholder. That does give her authority over certain corporate decisions. This is insane, Oliver muttered. He's punishing me from the grave. I spoke for the first time since the will began. He's not punishing you, Oliver. He's reminding you where it all started. Oliver pushed back his chair, the scrape of the legs loud in the quiet room. He stood, hands on his hips, glaring down at me. You think you've won something here, he said, voice low but venomous. You have no idea what you're walking into. I met his stare, my voice steady. I walked away from your father at his worst. I can handle whatever comes next. Mr. Carroll, clearly sensing the rising tension, began gathering the papers. We will, of course, arrange for the transfer of assets in due course. I recommend you both seek independent legal counsel regarding the management of your respective inheritances. Oliver didn't look at him. His gaze stayed locked on me until the last document was tucked away. Then he turned sharply and left the room, the door swinging shut behind him with a muted thud. I sat for a moment longer, letting the reality settle. 51%. Harrowfield. £10 million. I hadn't expected any of it. I didn't know whether to feel grateful, vindicated, or suspicious. But one thing was certain. Whatever Daniel's reasons, he'd just tied me back into a life I'd thought I'd left for good. And Oliver, my own son, wasn't going to make that easy. I hadn't planned to stay in Mayfair after the will reading. My instinct was to put as much distance as possible between myself and Oliver's fury. But Mr. Carroll stopped me at the door. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, holding up a small black envelope. "There's one more thing." It was heavier than I expected, sealed with a strip of deep red wax pressed into the shape of a W. I turned it over in my hands. "This was given to me with instructions to pass it to you in private," Mr. Carroll said. "It contains a USB drive and a letter. I believe you'll want to view the contents alone." I slid it into my bag without a word. Back at my small flat in Surrey, the envelope sat on the kitchen table like a live wire. The late afternoon light filtered through the blinds, painting the laminate in stripes. I made tea I didn't drink, reheated soup I didn't touch. Finally, I broke the seal. Inside was indeed a USB drive and a single sheet of thick cream paper, folded once. The handwriting on the front, my name, was unmistakably Daniel's. I sat down, unfolded the letter, and began to read. "Eleanor, if you are reading this, it means the will has been read, and Oliver is likely furious. That was not my intention, at least not entirely. You have every right to be suspicious of my motives. After all, I was never a man who gave without expecting something in return. There is a video on the enclosed drive. It will explain more than I can put into this letter. Watch it before you decide what to do with what I've left you. One last thing. The choice is yours. You can walk away from it all, and no one would blame you. But if you decide to step back into this world, know that the company and Oliver will need someone willing to tell them the truths they don't want to hear. D. I stared at the letter for a long time. The Daniel I'd known would never have admitted to not entirely pure intentions. That alone made my hands unsteady as I plugged the USB drive into my old laptop. The file was simply named for Eleanor.mp4. I clicked it. The screen flickered, and then Daniel appeared. Older than in the photograph at the funeral, thinner, his hair more silver than gray. He sat at his desk at Harrowfield, the leather chair familiar, the shelves behind him lined with the same books we'd once bought together. "Eleanor," he began, his voice lower than I remembered, almost rough. "If you're watching this, I'm gone." He leaned forward slightly, folding his hands on the desk. "I know you think I stopped loving you a long time ago. The truth is, I stopped knowing how to love you in a way that mattered to you. Business was easier. It had rules I could master. People were unpredictable, and I was a coward." I sat back, stunned. Daniel was many things, but self-critical was not one of them. He continued, eyes steady on the camera. "I didn't bring you here to hear apologies. You deserve them, but they're too late to make a difference. What I need you to know is this. Oliver is not ready to run the company. Not because he lacks intelligence, but because he has only ever seen the easy half of the equation. You gave me the other half in the early days. Patience, grit, the willingness to go without so something bigger could survive." A faint smile touched his lips. "He doesn't know what it's like to pawn a wedding ring to make payroll. You do." My throat tightened. That had been one of our darkest days, one we'd never spoken about afterward. Daniel's tone shifted, more deliberate now. "You will have the controlling shares. That means you can outvote him if you must. I'm asking you not to use that power to punish him, tempting as it may be. Use it to teach him. And if he refuses to learn, then you'll know what to do." He leaned back in the chair. For a moment, he looked almost tired. "I didn't leave this to you out of guilt, though I have plenty. I left it because you are the only person I trust to keep it honest. Even if you hate me, I know you won't let the Whitmore name turn into something hollow." He paused, eyes dropping for the first time. "This is the last thing I'll ever ask you for. You can say no, but if you say yes, I think you might just save him." The video ended abruptly, the screen going black. I sat there in the dim kitchen, the hum of the fridge the only sound. My tea had gone cold. Part of me wanted to laugh at the audacity of it. Daniel, the man who'd pushed me out of his life, now asking me to step back into the center of his empire. But another part of me, the part that had once believed in what we were building together, felt something else entirely. Not nostalgia, not forgiveness, something closer to inevitability. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Meet me tomorrow. Harrowfield. Noon. We need to talk. No signature, but I didn't need one. Oliver. I stared at the screen, then at the USB drive still plugged into my laptop. The cursor blinked over the black frame of the video's end, like it was waiting for me to decide which way the story would go. For the first time in years, I wasn't entirely sure I was the one in control. But I knew one thing. Walking away wasn't going to be as simple as closing a file. Harrowfield looked exactly as I remembered it, and nothing like the place I'd once called home. The gravel drive still crunched under the tires. The manicured lawns rolled away in perfect symmetry, and the great oak trees stood sentinel along the boundaries. But where I'd once felt pride pulling up to these gates, now there was only a kind of wary detachment. Oliver was waiting at the front steps, hands in the pockets of a tailored navy coat. No handshake, no greeting, just a curt nod as I stepped out of the car. Inside, he said, turning without waiting for me to follow. The main hall smelled faintly of furniture polish and something more sterile, like the air had been cleared of any trace of the life we'd lived here. The grand staircase was still framed by the same oil portraits, but the faces seemed colder, as if they too had taken sides. Oliver led me into the study, Daniel's study. The heavy desk, the green banker's lamp, the shelves lined with leather-bound volumes no one had ever read for pleasure. He closed the door behind us. "I'll make this simple," he said, walking to the desk and planting his hands on the surface. "You sign the controlling shares over to me, and we can both get on with our lives." I set my bag on the chair, removing my gloves slowly. "That's not going to happen." His eyes narrowed. "You think you can run Whitmore Developments? You've been out of the picture for decades." "And yet," I said, "your father left it to me, not you." "He was senile," Oliver shot back. "Confused. You know he wasn't thinking straight at the end." I kept my tone calm. "He was thinking clearly enough to know that handing you full control would destroy the company." Oliver's jaw clenched. "This isn't about the company. This is about you punishing me. You've hated me since the divorce." I felt the heat rise, but I didn't let it into my voice. "I never hated you, Oliver. I hated what this place, what he turned you into." He gave a sharp laugh. "Spare me the psychology. You walked out on us. You forfeited your right to lecture me about who I am." I stepped closer to the desk. "I walked out because staying would have killed me. And if you think Daniel didn't understand that by the end, you didn't know him at all." His knuckles whitened against the polished oak. "You're not keeping those shares." I tilted my head. "Then you'll have to take them from me. And you know what that will mean." Publicly. For the first time, his gaze faltered. We both knew the optics. Son suing mother for control of his late father's empire would stain the Whitmore name in a way no amount of PR could polish away. "You're going to ruin everything," he said, quieter now, but no less intense. "No," I said. "I'm going to protect it. From you, if I have to." He looked at me for a long moment, then turned sharply toward the window. Outside, the ground stretched toward the horizon, immaculate and empty. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower. "You don't understand what this world is like now. Deals are faster, dirtier. You can't survive playing by the rules you and Dad used in the 80s. "I understand perfectly," I said. "But I also know that if you strip a company of its integrity, it stops being worth the trouble of keeping it." He spun back to face me. "Integrity doesn't pay dividends. Neither does arrogance, I said. Not forever. The silence between us was taut as wire. Then I reached into my bag and pulled out the envelope Daniel had left me with the letter and USB drive. I slid it across the desk toward him. He left a message for both of us. I watched mine. You should watch yours. He didn't touch it. I don't need to hear more of his excuses. Maybe you don't, I said. But you need to hear what he actually thought of you, not what you've decided to believe. For a moment, I thought he'd throw the envelope back at me. Instead, he snatched it up, tore it open, and stared at the folded paper inside. As his eyes moved over the words, I saw something flicker across his face. Confusion, then disbelief, then something softer, almost like loss. When he finished, he set the letter down without meeting my eyes. "This changes nothing," he said finally. But his voice had lost some of its edge. "It changes everything," I replied. "You just don't see it yet." I picked up my gloves and bag, moving toward the door. At the threshold, I turned back. "I'm not here to take this away from you, Oliver. I'm here to make sure you deserve it." For a second, he didn't move. Then quietly, he said, "And if I never do?" I held his gaze. "Then it will go to someone who will." And with that, I left him standing in Daniel's study, the letter lying open on the desk between us. The rain had started by the time I left Harrowfield. Fine, misty drops, the kind that cling to your coat and blur the edges of the world. The gravel crunched beneath my boots as I walked back to the car, not in a rush, not looking back. The house loomed behind me, grand, immovable, heavy with history. For years it had been my cage. Today it was just a building. I closed the car door and sat there for a moment, my hands resting on the steering wheel, watching the rain trace thin silver lines down the windscreen. For the first time in weeks, I could breathe without feeling the weight of someone else's expectations on my chest. Back in Surrey, the flat felt warmer than usual. I hung my coat, lit the small lamp in the corner, and put the kettle on. The quiet was almost startling after the sharp edges of Harrowfield. On the table sat the letter from Daniel, folded neatly where I'd left it. Beside it, the USB drive, still in its black plastic casing. I hadn't unplugged it since watching his message. I reached over and touched it, half expecting it to still be warm. In the days after the will reading, I'd been so certain I was stepping into a fight, a battle for control, for legacy, for whatever scraps of respect could be salvaged between me and Oliver. And maybe I still was. But Daniel's words kept circling in my head. Don't use the power to punish him. Use it to teach him. It was the kind of thing you tell someone when you know they've been hurt so deeply that revenge seems like the only logical conclusion. And maybe that had been true of me once. But now I wasn't so sure revenge was worth the time it stole. I made tea, carried the mug to the small desk by the window, and pulled out a notepad. At the top of the page, I wrote, "What stays, what changes." Under stays, I listed the company's core principles from when Daniel and I had started it, things we hadn't put in writing but had lived by. Never undercut on safety, never take a contract you wouldn't stand by yourself, and never, ever put profit over people. Under changes, I wrote Oliver's name. Then I crossed it out and replaced it with leadership culture. It was petty, maybe, but it made the point. 2 weeks later, I returned to Harrowfield. This time not for Oliver, but for the company board meeting. The room was full of suits, familiar faces grown older, a few new ones sizing me up like a chess piece that had just been introduced mid-game. Oliver was already seated at the head of the table. He didn't stand when I entered, but he did nod. A small, stiff acknowledgement. We went through the agenda without fireworks. That in itself felt like a small victory. After the meeting, as the others filed out, Oliver stayed behind. "You're not what I expected," he said finally, his voice low enough that it didn't carry. "And what did you expect?" I asked. A war, he admitted. One of us taking the other apart until there was nothing left. I held his gaze. Maybe we still could, but it wouldn't bring your father back, and it wouldn't make either of us proud. He looked down at the table, his fingers drumming once against the polished surface. I read the rest of his letter, the part about the early years, about you. And maybe he was right. I don't know how to build from nothing. I've only ever inherited. It was the closest thing to vulnerability I'd heard from him in years. You can still learn, I said, if you're willing to stop thinking you already know everything. A ghost of a smile tugged at his mouth. That's going to be harder than you think. I smiled back, just enough. I've dealt with worse students. The months that followed weren't easy. We clashed over contracts, over expansion plans, over the kind of risks Daniel would have leapt at, and I insisted on vetting twice. But beneath the arguments was something new, an understanding that neither of us was walking away. It was enough, for now. One evening, late in the year, I found myself back at Harrowfield, not for business, but for something else entirely. Oliver had sent a terse invitation. Dinner. No agenda. 7 p.m. I almost didn't go, but curiosity won. The dining room was as grand as ever, the long table polished to a mirror shine. At one end sat Oliver, at the other, an empty chair. In front of it, on the plate, sat something unexpected, a small, wrapped parcel with a silver ribbon. I took my seat and untied it. Inside was a set of piano keys, old, slightly yellowed ivory, clearly taken from a real instrument. They're from the first piano you and Dad bought, Oliver said. I found it in storage. Thought you might want a piece of it. For a moment, I couldn't speak. That piano had been the heart of our first flat. The one Daniel had joked was worth more than the walls around it. Thank you, I said, my voice softer than I'd intended. Dinner was awkward, but civil. We talked about the company, about some of the staff I remembered, even about the gardens at Harrowfield. When I left that night, I realized something important. The fight wasn't over, but the war might be avoidable. Weeks later, back in my Surrey flat, I placed the piano keys on my desk. On impulse, I opened my laptop and plugged in the USB drive again. Daniel's face filled the screen, just as it had before. This time, I didn't focus on the words as much as the pauses between them, the way his eyes softened when he mentioned the early days. When the video ended, I sat back and closed my eyes. Some doors stay shut forever. Others close just long enough for you to hear the music start again on the other side. That night, I put the piano keys on the windowsill where the morning light would catch them. It wasn't a reconciliation, not yet, but it was a beginning. And beginnings, I'd learned, were worth protecting, just as much as endings.